The Widener family is the clearest example of both the extreme wealth and the tragic collapse of America's Gilded Age. For a short time, when people heard their name, they immediately thought of massive wealth built from the boom of American cities. This enterprise was started by Peter Errol Brown Widener, 1834 to 1915. He began as just a butcher, but rose to become one of the richest men in American history by taking over huge businesses in streetcars, steel, and tobacco. For 2 generations, the Wideners shaped much of America's urban infrastructure. The clearest example is the Philadelphia Traction Company, which held a monopoly on the city's transport. Their influence reached the highest levels of industry, partnering with big names like Andrew Carnegie of U.S. Steel and J.P. Morgan of the International Mercantile Marine, the company that owned the RMS Titanic. Their massive fortune was estimated at $23 to $25 billion in today's money when Peter died. This money funded legendary art collections, huge mansions like Linwood Hall, and major charitable projects, including the Widener Library at Harvard. But unlike the long-lasting Rockefeller dynasty, the Wideners' time was defined by a terrible downfall. Their history is marked by ruthless robber baron tactics, corruption allegations, and most famously the Titanic disaster, which killed 2 of the family's heirs. This series of blows eventually caused their fortune to evaporate and their name to be almost forgotten. It's a harsh lesson about how quickly Gilded Age power could disappear. How war made him a millionaire. Unlike many Gilded Age dynasties born into privilege, the Widener story starts with Peter A.B. Widener, navigating the raw, competitive realities of his Philadelphia butcher shop. Peter Errol Brown Widener, born in 1834, was the embodiment of the Gilded Age paradox. A man of humble origins who, through a combination of relentless ambition, shrewd timing, and a flexible moral compass, clawed his way to almost unimaginable wealth. He was not born a baron, he became one, mastering the brutal alchemy that transformed the raw materials of urban growth, meat, transportation, steel, and political influence, into a personal empire. Peter Widener's childhood was defined by the working-class realities of antebellum Philadelphia. His family was not impoverished, but they were far removed from the city's established elite. He received a basic public school education, and like many ambitious young men of his era with limited prospects, sought his fortune in a trade. In 1857, at the age of 23, he opened his own butcher shop. This was a common path, a respectable if unglamorous profession. But Widener possessed an uncommon drive. He was not content merely to serve the local neighborhood. He saw the larger patterns, the flows of supply and demand that governed the burgeoning city. His first great opportunity arrived with the cataclysm of the American Civil War in 1861. War, then as now, was a ravenous engine of consumption, and the Union Army needed staggering quantities of food to sustain its massive mobilization. Specifically, it needed meat, preserved, portable, high-energy meat, primarily pork and beef. Peter Widener, with his butcher's knowledge and growing network of suppliers, saw his chance. He aggressively pursued and secured lucrative contracts to supply meat to the Union Army. This was not a simple matter of scaling up his existing shop. It required navigating a complex, often corrupt, web of military procurement officers, political connections, and logistical challenges. Widener proved adept at all 3. Details from this period are murky, often obscured by the chaos of war and the self-serving narratives later constructed by Gilded Age tycoons. However, historical accounts and later analyses suggest that Widener was remarkably successful. He reportedly earned upwards of $50,000 a year during the war years from these contracts alone. In today's currency, that translates to well over $1 million annually. This wartime profiteering became the seed capital for his future empire. It also became the first stain on his reputation. Critics then and later would accuse men like Widener of being shoddy contractors, prioritizing profit over quality, and exploiting the national crisis for personal gain. While concrete evidence of specific malfeasance by Widener is scarce, the sheer scale of his wartime earnings compared to his humble pre-war status inevitably fueled suspicion. He had learned his first crucial lesson. Immense fortunes could be made by positioning oneself at the nexus of government spending and essential commodities. As the war ended in 1865, Widener did not return to the quiet life of a neighborhood butcher. He had tasted wealth and power, and he understood that the real opportunities lay not in selling goods directly, but in controlling the systems that moved goods and people. The post-war era saw the explosive growth of American cities, particularly Philadelphia. Fueled by industrialization and immigration, the city was sprawling outwards, creating an urgent need for new infrastructure, especially transportation. Widener, flush with his wartime profits, began looking for his next move. He briefly dabbled in real estate speculation, but his true focus shifted to the chaotic, burgeoning world of urban transit. In the 1860s and 1870s, Philadelphia, like most American cities, was served by a confusing patchwork of small independent horse-drawn streetcar lines. Each line typically served only a few blocks, required separate fares, and operated with little coordination. It was inefficient, inconvenient, and ripe for consolidation. Widener understood that controlling transportation meant controlling the lifeblood of the city. He also understood that securing the necessary franchises, the exclusive rights granted by the city government to operate on public streets, required political influence. So, Peter Widener entered politics. In the 1870s, he successfully ran for and served on the Philadelphia City Council. He also held the powerful position of city treasurer. This was not a career change driven by civic duty. It was a strategic business move. His time in municipal government gave him an intimate understanding of the city's power structures, the key political players, and crucially, the often corrupt process by which valuable franchises and contracts were awarded. Historical accounts from Pennsylvania archives and critical analyses of Philadelphia's Gilded Age politics paint a picture of rampant municipal corruption. City council seats, treasury positions, and mayoral offices were often seen as pathways to personal enrichment. Franchises for utilities, transportation, and construction were frequently granted not based on merit, but on bribes, kickbacks, and political favors. Critics labeled men like Widener robber barons precisely because they allegedly built their fortunes by exploiting this corrupt system, using political office to secure monopolies, and then charging the public exorbitant rates for essential services. While serving as city treasurer, Widener began making his first strategic investments in the horsecar lines. He wasn't just buying stock, he was forging alliances. His most important partner was William Lukens Elkins. Elkins was another ambitious Philadelphian who had made his fortune in oil refining and city utilities. The two men shared a vision: consolidate the fragmented streetcar lines into a single dominant entity. Their alliance was cemented by family ties when Widener's eldest surviving son, George Dunton Widener, married Elkins's daughter, Eleanor Elkins. This union created a powerful family compact that would dominate Philadelphia's transit and utilities for decades. The technological catalyst for their plan, arrived in the early 1880s: electrification. The jerky, slow, manure-fouling horse car was obsolete. The future was the electric streetcar, or trolley. It was faster, cleaner, more efficient, and could carry far more passengers. But electrifying hundreds of miles of track and building power stations required immense capital, and critically, new city franchises. In 1883, Widener and Elkins made their move. They pooled their resources, leveraged their political connections, and formed the Philadelphia Traction Company. This was not just another streetcar company. It was envisioned from the start as a holding company, a vehicle designed to absorb its competitors through aggressive buyouts and mergers. The strategy was ruthless. Armed with capital and political backing, Philadelphia Traction began systematically acquiring the smaller horse car lines. They offered buyouts, engaged in price wars, and allegedly used their political influence to deny crucial franchise renewals to rivals. Within a few short years, the company had swallowed dozens of smaller operators. They then embarked on the massive, expensive project of electrifying the entire system. By the early 1890s, the Widener-Elkins syndicate had achieved near total monopoly over Philadelphia's surface transportation. Philadelphia Traction controlled hundreds of miles of track, reportedly over 600 miles at its peak, and operated a fleet of over 500 electric trolleys. They dictated fares, schedules, and routes. Their control was so absolute that critics claimed it was impossible to cross the city without paying tribute to the traction ring. Annual revenues reportedly soared to over $10 million in the 1890s, an astronomical sum for the era. This monopoly, while immensely profitable, generated significant public resentment. The company was accused of providing poor service, overcrowding cars, and most contentiously, raising fares. The standard 5-cent fare, common across American cities, was often challenged by the traction company, leading to fare increases, sometimes to 6 or even 7 cents, that sparked public outrage and labor protests, particularly in 1895. Workers on the lines also complained of low wages, long hours, and dangerous working conditions, common grievances in the Gilded Age but exacerbated by the company's monopoly power. Widener, however, seemed largely impervious to public criticism. He had secured his fortune and his dominance. He understood that controlling an essential urban service provided immense leverage. People had to get to work, to shop, to live their lives, and in Philadelphia that meant riding his trolleys. Having conquered Philadelphia's transit, Widener and Elkins, often working in concert with other financiers like the New York-based William C. Whitney and Thomas Fortune Ryan, began replicating their traction monopoly model in other major American cities. They formed syndicates that bought up and consolidated streetcar lines in New York City, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and elsewhere. Widener became not just a Philadelphia magnate, but a national traction king, one of the most powerful figures in the rapidly urbanizing nation. But Widener's ambition extended beyond streetcars. He understood the interconnected nature of industrial growth. His trolleys needed steel rails, electricity, and vast amounts of capital. He began strategically diversifying his investments into the bedrock industries of the Gilded Age. His most significant move was into steel. He recognized that the explosive growth of cities, railroads, and skyscrapers created an insatiable demand for steel. He became an early and significant investor alongside the titan of the industry, Andrew Carnegie. When Carnegie, orchestrated by the legendary financier J.P. Morgan, consolidated the fragmented steel industry into the monolithic U.S. Steel Corporation. In 1901, Peter Widener was a key player. he emerged with a substantial block of shares in the new behemoth, reportedly holding around 10% of the company at one point. This investment alone significantly multiplied his already vast fortune, tying his wealth directly to the literal framework of modern America. He also followed the monopolistic logic into other burgeoning industries. He allied himself with James Buchanan Duke's American Tobacco Company, another trust that aggressively consolidated its market. He acquired shares in John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil, the most notorious monopoly of them all. Widener seemed drawn to these massive consolidations, understanding that true Gilded Age wealth came not from competition, but from its elimination. His most fateful investment, however, came in 1902. Once again partnering with J.P. Morgan, Widener became a major investor and director in Morgan's ambitious attempt to monopolize transatlantic shipping. The International Mercantile Marine Company, IMM, was a massive holding company that acquired numerous shipping lines, including Britain's prestigious White Star Line. Widener reportedly invested at least $1 million in this venture. Among the assets controlled by IMM through White Star was a new class of colossal ocean liners designed to dominate the lucrative North Atlantic route. One of these ships, then under construction, was the RMS Titanic. While building his industrial empire, Peter Widener simultaneously embarked on a parallel project, the construction of a social and cultural dynasty. Having achieved immense wealth, he sought the one thing money alone could not buy: respectability. Like many Gilded Age robber barons acutely aware of their often ruthless origins, Widener turned to art collecting and monumental architecture as a means of laundering his reputation and cementing his family's place among America's aristocracy. His transformation began in the 1880s, guided by the influential and notoriously expensive art dealer Joseph Duveen. Widener began amassing one of the most significant private art collections in American history. He focused primarily on European Old Masters, acquiring masterpieces by Rembrandt, Raphael, Van Dyck, Vermeer, Titian, and others. He spared no expense, reportedly spending over $5 million on art through Duveen alone. This was not just connoisseurship, it was a deliberate strategy. Owning these undisputed masterpieces conferred an instant cultural legitimacy, linking the former butcher to the great artistic traditions of European civilization. To house this growing collection and to physically manifest his imperial wealth, Widener commissioned the architect Horace Trumbauer to design a palace. Between 1897 and 1900, on a vast 300-acre estate in Elkins Park, just outside Philadelphia, Linwood Hall rose. It was and remains one of the largest private residences ever built in America. Designed in a grand neoclassical style, the 110-room mansion was Widener's answer to the great houses of European royalty, his personal Versailles. No expense was spared. The construction cost alone was estimated at $8 million, an almost unimaginable sum at the time. The interiors were lavish beyond comprehension, filled with marble, gold leaf, intricate plasterwork, and custom-made furnishings. The centerpiece was a vast 1,000-foot square art gallery, specifically designed to showcase Widener's collection under optimal museum-quality conditions. Linwood Hall was more than a home. It was a statement, a declaration that Peter Widener, the butcher's son, had arrived. But even these attempts at cultural refinement could not fully erase the controversial origins of his fortune. The construction of Linwood Hall itself generated criticism, with reports alleging the use of low-paid, non-union labor and exploitative working conditions. And the very source of the wealth that funded the art and the architecture, the streetcar monopoly, remained a source of public anger and political scrutiny. Widener, however, proved remarkably adept at navigating the changing political landscape. He understood the power of political influence, not just at the local level, but nationally. He became a major donor to the Republican Party, reportedly providing significant financial backing to President William McKinley's successful 1896 campaign. This high-level access provided a crucial shield. While the progressive era saw increasing public outcry against monopolistic trusts, culminating in the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, Widener largely managed to avoid the kind of direct federal assault that would eventually break up Standard Oil in 1911. His traction monopolies, while locally dominant, were perhaps seen as less threatening than Rockefeller's national oil empire. Furthermore, his diversification into steel, tobacco, and shipping spread his influence across multiple sectors, making him a less singular target. Local investigations into municipal corruption in Philadelphia, particularly around 1905, did scrutinize the granting of traction franchises, but Widener himself was never indicted. He had built his defenses well. His personal life remained intensely private after the death of his wife, Hannah Josephine Dunton, from cancer in 1896. They had 3 sons, Harry, who died young in 1874, and George and Joseph, who would become his heirs apparent. While rumors suggested Peter Widener later formed a private common-law marriage, he never remarried publicly, maintaining the image of the devoted patriarch. By the early 1910s, Peter A.B. Widener stood at the pinnacle of American society. He was fabulously wealthy, politically connected, and housed in a palace filled with masterpieces. His sons were integrated into the highest levels of finance and society. He had transformed himself from a Philadelphia butcher into a national titan, a peer of Carnegie, Morgan, and Rockefeller. He had built an empire seemingly impervious to challenge. But the very investments that symbolized his arrival, particularly his stake in the grandest, most luxurious ocean liner ever built, contained the seeds of a tragedy that would shatter his carefully constructed world and expose the profound vulnerability hidden beneath the Gilded Age facade. The man who choked a city. Peter Widener's transformation from a wartime meat contractor to a national traction king was not merely a matter of accumulating wealth. It was a masterclass in the ruthless architecture of Gilded Age monopoly. Having secured near total control over Philadelphia's streetcar system through the Philadelphia Traction Company, Widener did not rest. He understood that true, enduring power lay not in dominating a single city or industry, but in weaving an intricate web of control across multiple, interconnected sectors. His strategy involved relentless consolidation, strategic alliances with the era's most powerful financiers, the calculated use of political influence to neutralize regulation, and a diversification into the core industries, steel, tobacco, shipping, that formed the bedrock of America's industrial explosion. This was not just business, it was empire building, conducted with a singular focus on eliminating competition and maximizing profit, often at the expense of the public and the workforce. The Philadelphia Traction Company, formed in 1883 with his key ally William Lukens Elkins, was the blueprint. Its success was built on a brutal but effective three-pronged strategy: consolidation, electrification, and political capture. The consolidation phase was a relentless campaign of acquisition. Philadelphia, in the 1870s and early 1880s, was choked by literally dozens, perhaps over 100, small independent horse car lines. Each operated on limited routes, often just a few blocks long, requiring passengers to pay multiple fares for a single crosstown journey. Widener and Elkins saw this fragmentation not as a public service, but as an inefficiency ripe for exploitation. Armed with the capital Widener had amassed during the Civil War and Elkins's own fortune from oil and utilities, they began buying. Their methods were aggressive. They offered cash buyouts to smaller operators, often at prices that seemed generous, but were predicated on the future monopoly profits. When owners refused to sell, Philadelphia Traction allegedly deployed harder tactics. Price wars erupted, with the larger, better capitalized traction companies slashing fares on competing routes to drive smaller lines into bankruptcy. Simultaneously, Widener and Elkins allegedly leveraged their growing political influence within Philadelphia's notoriously corrupt city government. Competitors suddenly found their crucial franchise renewals delayed or denied. Necessary permits for track repairs or route extensions became inexplicably tangled in bureaucratic red tape. The message was clear: sell to the traction ring or be choked out of existence. One by one, the smaller lines fell. Companies like the Union Passenger Railway, the Hestonville, Mantua, and Fairmount Passenger Railroad, and dozens of others were absorbed into the growing Philadelphia Traction conglomerate. By the late 1880s, the consolidation phase was largely complete. Widener and Elkins controlled the vast majority of surface transit within the city limits. The next phase was electrification. The horse car was slow, inefficient, and produced mountains of polluting manure. The electric trolley, powered by overhead wires drawing current from massive coal-fired power stations, was the future. It was faster, cleaner, could carry more passengers, and crucially, offered potentially higher profit margins. But electrification was enormously expensive. It required tearing up existing tracks, laying new, heavier rails, erecting thousands of poles and miles of overhead wires, and building enormous centralized power generation facilities. This capital-intensive phase was where Widener's access to finance became critical. His growing national reputation and his alliances with New York financiers like William C. Whitney and Thomas Fortune Ryan allowed Philadelphia Traction to raise the necessary millions. The city, influenced by Widener's political allies, readily granted the franchises needed for this massive infrastructure overhaul. Philadelphia was rapidly transformed into a city defined by the screech and spark of the electric trolley. The final piece was political capture. Widener's early involvement in Philadelphia politics, serving as city treasurer and on the city council, was not a temporary foray. It was the foundation of his business model. He understood that a transportation monopoly, reliant on public streets and government franchises, could only survive with the active complicity of the political machine. He became a master of this game. He cultivated relationships with key figures in Philadelphia's powerful Republican political organization. He became a major campaign donor. Critics alleged outright bribery and kickbacks were common, though proving such quid pro quo arrangements in the Gilded Age's murky political environment was notoriously difficult. What was undeniable was the result. Philadelphia Traction received extraordinarily favorable treatment from the city government. Franchises were granted with little public oversight. Fare increase requests were often rubber-stamped. Attempts by reformers to impose stricter regulations on service quality, safety, or labor practices were consistently blocked or watered down. The company operated with a degree of autonomy that enraged the public but ensured its profitability. The 1895 transit strike and subsequent public protests over fare hikes highlighted the deep public resentment, but ultimately did little to loosen the traction ring's grip. They had successfully insulated their monopoly from both political and popular challenge within the city. Having perfected this model in Philadelphia, Widener and his syndicate partners, Elkins, Whitney, and Ryan, became the traction kings of America. They exported their strategy nationwide. They targeted cities like New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and others where fragmented transit systems offered similar opportunities for consolidation and control. In New York City, they battled for control of the surface lines, eventually merging various companies into the Metropolitan Street Railway Company, creating a near monopoly south of Harlem. In Chicago, they were involved in the complex, often violent, struggles to consolidate the city's sprawling streetcar network under the banner of companies like the Chicago Union Traction Company. These ventures were incredibly lucrative but also deeply controversial, often involving spectacular financial manipulations, stock watering schemes, and battles with reformist mayors like Chicago's Carter Harrison Jr. or New York's Seth Low. Widener became a national symbol of the Traction Trust, one of the most powerful and publicly reviled figures of the Gilded Age. But Widener's ambitions transcended trolleys. He saw the bigger industrial picture. His streetcar empires consumed vast quantities of steel for rails and copper for electrical wire. They were powered by coal. They were financed by the great investment banks. He began to strategically place bets in these upstream and downstream industries, weaving his traction interests into the very fabric of American industrial capitalism. His most significant move was into steel. The late 19th century was the age of steel. Railroads crisscrossed the continent. Cities scraped the sky with new steel frame buildings, and bridges spanned rivers, all built on a foundation of steel. Widener recognized this fundamental demand. He became an early and substantial investor in the steel mills that were rising around Pittsburgh, most notably those controlled by Andrew Carnegie. He was not merely a passive investor, he was an insider. He cultivated relationships with Carnegie and, more importantly, with the man who would orchestrate the industry's ultimate consolidation, J.P. Morgan. When Morgan, in a legendary feat of financial engineering, bought out Carnegie and merged dozens of competing steel companies into the colossal U.S. Steel Corporation in 1901, Peter Widener was at the table. His exact role in the U.S. steel negotiations is debated by historians, but his influence and financial backing were significant. He emerged from the deal as one of the largest individual shareholders in the new behemoth, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. His stake, estimated at times to be around 10%, instantly catapulted him into a new stratosphere of wealth. His fortune was no longer just tied to the fares collected on city streets. It was now directly linked to the production of the fundamental building block of the modern American economy. This U.S. steel investment became a cornerstone of the Widener fortune, generating enormous dividends for decades. Widener applied the same logic of consolidation and insider access to other key industries. He recognized the addictive power and explosive growth potential of tobacco. He became a significant investor in James Buchanan Duke's American Tobacco Company, formed in 1890. This trust used ruthless tactics, similar to Widener's own in the traction industry, to absorb hundreds of competitors and achieve near total dominance over the cigarette and tobacco market. Widener profited immensely from this consolidation. He also, perhaps inevitably, invested in Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller's infamous petroleum trust. While his stake was likely smaller than in steel or tobacco, it demonstrated his adherence to the Gilded Age maxim: find the monopoly, invest heavily, and reap the rewards. He seemed constitutionally drawn to these massive market-dominating trusts, viewing competition as a chaotic nuisance to be eliminated. This strategy of diversification across core, monopolistic industries, traction, steel, tobacco, oil, made Widener's fortune incredibly resilient. While his initial wealth came from the volatile world of urban transit, his later investments provided a stable, diversified base that could weather economic downturns, like the Panic of 1893. His net worth soared, growing from an estimated $50 million in 1900 to potentially over $100 million by the time of his death in 1915, a sum equivalent to 23 to 25 billion in today's dollars, placing him firmly among the wealthiest men in American history. His final major Gilded Age investment proved to be his most tragic. In 1902, J.P. Morgan, emboldened by his success in forging U.S. steel, attempted an even more audacious consolidation, monopolizing the lucrative and prestigious North Atlantic shipping trade. He formed the International Mercantile Marine Company, a massive holding company designed to buy out or force into alliance the major American, British, and German shipping lines. Peter Widener, a trusted Morgan ally and a man who understood the strategic importance of transportation, became a founding investor and a director of IMM. He reportedly poured at least $1 million into the venture. IMM successfully acquired several lines, including Britain's venerable White Star Line. White Star, in a bid to compete with its rival Cunard, was in the process of building three massive, technologically advanced, and luxuriously appointed ocean liners: the Olympic, the Britannic, and the ship intended to be the jewel in their crown, the RMS Titanic. Widener's investment in IMM was a logical extension of his Gilded Age philosophy. It was another bet on consolidation, infrastructure, and the relentless growth of global trade. As a director, he was privy to the plans and progress of the great White Star liners. The Titanic was not just a ship, it was a symbol of the very industrial and financial power that Widener himself represented. His financial fate, and soon his family's personal fate, would become inextricably linked to the maiden voyage of that unsinkable vessel. While Widener mastered the ruthless mechanics of monopoly, he also understood the importance of political protection. The rise of the trusts in the late 19th century had generated a powerful public backlash. Muckraking journalists like Ida Tarbell and Lincoln Steffens fueled public anger. Politicians responded, albeit often reluctantly, with reform efforts. The most significant threat was the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. This federal law, though vaguely worded and initially weakly enforced, declared illegal every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy, in restraint of trade or commerce. It was a potential dagger aimed at the heart of Widener's consolidated empires. Widener, however, proved remarkably adept at political defense. He cultivated deep ties within the Republican Party, the dominant political force of the Gilded Age. He became a major financial contributor, funneling significant sums to state and national campaigns. His support for President William McKinley's election in 1896 reportedly bought him valuable access and influence in Washington. This high-level political cover helped shield Widener from the most aggressive antitrust enforcement. While Theodore Roosevelt later gained fame as the trust buster, his administration tended to focus on monopolies that operated across state lines and directly impacted national markets, like Standard Oil or American Tobacco. Widener's traction monopolies, while dominant locally, were often structured as complex webs of state-chartered companies, making them harder targets for federal prosecution under the Sherman Act's interpretation at the time. Furthermore, Widener's diversification worked in his favor. Unlike Rockefeller, who was synonymous with oil, Widener's interests were spread across traction, steel, tobacco, and shipping. He was a harder figure to demonize as the sole mastermind of a single evil trust. He did not escape scrutiny entirely. The municipal corruption investigations in Philadelphia around 1905, fueled by Stephens's reporting and local reform movements, did examine the cozy relationship between the traction company and city officials. Allegations of bribery in securing franchises were revisited, but ultimately Peter Widener himself was never indicted. He operated skillfully in the gray areas, using lawyers, lobbyists, and campaign contributions to maintain his influence while avoiding direct legal culpability. His success in evading major antitrust action, unlike Rockefeller, stands as a testament to his political acumen and the effectiveness of his quiet power strategy at the highest levels. This strategy extended to labor relations, though here the quiet approach often gave way to Gilded Age brutality. While Widener, like some other industrialists of the era, made gestures towards paternalism, providing some basic amenities for workers or contributing to local charities, his core labor strategy was one of low wages, long hours, and fierce opposition to unionization. Reports from Pennsylvania labor bureaus in the 1890s and early 1900s paint a grim picture of conditions for traction workers. Motormen and conductors often worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week for wages that barely supported a family. Safety standards were minimal. Accidents involving trolleys, derailments, collisions, electrocutions from downed wires were frequent and often fatal, with dozens of incidents reported annually in Philadelphia alone. The company allegedly used cheap, often immigrant labor, particularly for track laying and maintenance, knowing these workers had little bargaining power. Attempts by workers to organize were met with swift and harsh resistance. The 1895 Philadelphia transit strike, sparked by demands for better wages and shorter hours, was broken through a combination of hiring strikebreakers, deploying private security forces, and leveraging the support of the city police. Widener and Elkins, like most Gilded Age capitalists, viewed unions not as legitimate representatives of labor, but as dangerous socialist conspiracies that threatened their property rights and managerial authority. Their success in keeping their massive workforce largely non-unionized was another key factor in maintaining the profitability of their traction empire. By the early 1910s, Peter Widener had constructed an empire built on layers of control: horizontal control through the consolidation of competitors within industries like traction and tobacco, vertical control by investing in core suppliers like steel, financial control through alliances with J.P. Morgan and access to Wall Street capital, and political control through the careful cultivation of municipal and federal influence. His fortune seemed unassailable, his legacy secured through his vast art collection and the palace of Linwood Hall. He had navigated the treacherous currents of the Gilded Age, emerging as one of its ultimate survivors and beneficiaries. But the very system he had mastered, the relentless drive for scale, speed, and profit, embodied by the great ocean liners of the IMM, was about to deliver a blow from which his family and his carefully constructed dynasty would never fully recover. He died on Titanic. She built a library. By the spring of 1912, the Widener family stood at the absolute zenith of American Gilded Age society. Peter A. B. Widener, the patriarch, was nearly 80 years old, one of the wealthiest men in the world, his empire spanning traction, steel, tobacco, and shipping. His palace, Linwood Hall, housed a collection of old masters that rivaled any museum. His eldest surviving son and heir apparent, George Dunton Widener, was a respected financier in his own right, deeply involved in managing the family's vast interests, including his father's directorship at the International Mercantile Marine. George was married to Eleanor Elkins Widener, the daughter of Peter's longtime business partner, William Lukens Elkins, uniting two of Philadelphia's most powerful fortunes. They were the epitome of the American aristocracy, living lives of unimaginable privilege, insulated by layers of wealth and influence. Their eldest son, Harry Elkins Widener, embodied the next stage of the dynasty's evolution. Born in 1885, Harry was not groomed to be a ruthless industrialist like his grandfather or a financier like his father. He was a product of inherited wealth, educated at Harvard, and possessed of a refined scholarly passion, book collecting. Harry was a bibliophile of extraordinary dedication and means. By his mid-20s, he had already amassed a remarkable collection of rare books and manuscripts, focusing on English literature, particularly Shakespeare, Dickens, Thackeray, and Robert Louis Stevenson. He traveled extensively, haunting the elite bookshops of London and Paris, pursuing rare first editions and unique association copies with the same single-minded focus his grandfather had applied to acquiring streetcar lines. He dreamed of eventually donating his collection to his beloved Harvard, envisioning a library built to house it. In the early months of 1912, George, Eleanor, and Harry embarked on a trip to Europe. George had business interests to attend to related partly to IMM and the upcoming maiden voyage of its crown jewel, the RMS Titanic. Eleanor, a prominent Philadelphia society hostess, intended to acquire furnishings and perhaps a trousseau for her daughter's upcoming wedding, and Harry naturally planned to scour Europe for additions to his library. They booked their return passage on the most anticipated vessel in the world, the Titanic. Their decision to sail on the maiden voyage was entirely logical. As major investors in IMM and personal acquaintances of J.P. Morgan and J. Bruce Ismay, the Wideners were precisely the sort of elite passengers the Titanic was built to impress. They occupied some of the most luxurious suites on the ship. George and Eleanor were in cabin C-80, while Harry and his father's valet, Edwin Keeping, were next door in C-82. Eleanor's German maid, Emily Geiger, occupied a nearby cabin. Their tickets, number 113503, represented the pinnacle of transatlantic travel. Life aboard the Titanic during its first few days at sea was a microcosm of the gilded age world the Wideners inhabited. They mingled with the other titans of industry and finance who populated the first-class decks: John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, and Charles M. Hayes. George Widener, known for his congenial nature, moved easily within this elite circle. On the evening of Sunday, April 14th, George and Eleanor Widener hosted a lavish dinner party in the ship's opulent a la carte restaurant. It was intended to be the social highlight of the voyage, a gathering to honor the ship's commander, Captain Edward J. Smith. The guest list was a constellation of power: Captain Smith himself, Harry Widener, Major Archibald Butt, President Taft's military aide, Mr. and Mrs. John B. Thayer, and Mr. and Mrs. William E. Carter. The conversation reportedly flowed easily, touching on society gossip, business affairs, and the marvels of the great ship they were sailing on. Captain Smith, according to later accounts from survivors, seemed relaxed and confident, remarking on the smooth, uneventful crossing thus far. There was no premonition of doom. The dinner party broke up around 11 p.m. Just 40 minutes later, at 11:40 p.m., the Titanic struck the iceberg. The initial impact was, according to many survivors in first class, surprisingly subtle. Some described a slight shudder, a faint grinding noise, or a momentary pause in the engine's steady thrum. George, Eleanor, and Harry were likely preparing for bed, or perhaps enjoying a final conversation. They were initially unconcerned. George reportedly assured Eleanor that nothing serious could possibly happen to a ship of this size and modern construction. This sense of complacency, this Gilded Age faith in technology and invincibility, permeated the first-class decks in the early minutes after the collision. But as the ship began to list noticeably to starboard, and as crew members began urgently but quietly rousing passengers, the reality began to dawn. The Wideners, along with their servants, dressed and made their way to the boat deck. The scene they encountered was one of controlled chaos, overlaid with a fatal adherence to the social protocols of the era. The rule was women and children first, but in the initial stages, confusion reigned. The lifeboats were being launched, but many were leaving partially empty. There was a reluctance among many passengers, particularly the men, to believe the ship was actually sinking. The lights still blazed, the band played cheerful ragtime tunes, and the sheer scale of the Titanic seemed to mock the idea of imminent danger. Accounts of the Widener's final moments together are fragmented, pieced together primarily from Eleanor's later recollections, and the testimony of other survivors who saw them on deck. George Widener, true to the code of his class, focused on ensuring the safety of his wife. He escorted Eleanor and her maid, Emily Geiger, towards one of the lifeboats being loaded on the starboard side, likely Lifeboat 4. This boat was one of the last to leave the ship successfully. Around 1:55 a.m., less than half an hour before the final plunge. The separation was agonizing. According to some accounts, George told Eleanor he would get into a later boat. Harry, standing beside his father, appeared calm but resolute. He had reportedly helped several women into the boats. There was a moment, described by Eleanor, where Harry leaned down as her lifeboat was being lowered and spoke to her, though his exact words are lost to history. Some accounts suggest he mentioned his prized rare book, a 1598 edition of Francis Bacon's essays, which he had acquired in London and reportedly carried with him. As Lifeboat 4 descended towards the icy water, Eleanor watched her husband and son recede into the crowds on the tilting deck. It was the last time she would ever see them. George Dunton Widener and Harry Elkins Widener, along with George's valet Edwin Keeping, perished in the sinking. They joined the ranks of the Gilded Age elite claimed by the disaster: Astor, Guggenheim, Strauss, Thayer. Their deaths were not just a personal tragedy, they were a symbolic blow. The Titanic, the ultimate symbol of their era's technological hubris and social stratification, had claimed two of the heirs to one of its greatest fortunes. They died according to the rules of their world, men of privilege yielding their places to women, facing death with a stoicism expected of their class. But they died nonetheless, swallowed by the freezing Atlantic, along with over 1,500 other souls, most from the lower decks. Eleanor Widener and her maid survived the night in Lifeboat 4. They endured hours in the open boat, surrounded by the horrific sounds of the dying in the water, watching the great ship break apart and finally disappear beneath the waves around 2:20 a.m. They were eventually rescued by the RMS Carpathia shortly after dawn. The news reached Peter A.B. Widener back at Linwood Hall like a physical blow. He was 77 years old, already in declining health. The loss of his eldest son, his designated successor, and his brilliant grandson, the future of the family's cultural legacy, was devastating. He had built an empire designed to endure for generations, and in a single, inexplicable night, the two men meant to carry it forward were gone. Contemporary accounts describe Peter Widener as being utterly crushed by the tragedy. He largely withdrew from public life and the daily management of his vast business affairs. His health, already fragile, deteriorated rapidly. The traction king, the ruthless consolidator who had faced down rivals and politicians for decades, was broken by a grief that no amount of wealth could assuage. He clung to life for 3 more years, but the spark was gone. Peter A.B. Widener died at Linwood Hall on November 6, 1915, his death attributed by many to a broken heart. The Widener Dynasty, in a practical sense, died with him, while his surviving son, Joseph Early Widener, inherited control of the fortune and the art collection. The line of succession envisioned by the patriarch was shattered. The family's momentum, its sense of inevitable Gilded Age ascendancy, was irrevocably broken by the icy waters of the North Atlantic. The public reaction to the Titanic disaster was immense, a global outpouring of grief, shock, and anger. The sinking became an instant allegory for the end of an era, exposing the arrogance, the class divisions, and the hidden vulnerabilities of the Gilded Age. The fact that so many prominent millionaires perished, while hundreds of steerage passengers were left behind due to a lack of lifeboats, fueled intense criticism of the shipping lines, their owners, and the very social order they represented. Senate investigations were launched in the United States, led by Senator William Alden Smith, grilling J. Bruce Ismay and the surviving officers about the ship's speed, the warnings of ice, the insufficient number of lifeboats, and the handling of the evacuation. The findings were damning, revealing a chain of negligence and misplaced confidence that led directly to the disaster. While Peter Widener himself was too frail to testify, his directorship at IMM placed the family name squarely in the center of the controversy. The tragedy was not just a personal loss, it was a public relations nightmare, tarnishing the Gilded Age elite with a stain of perceived incompetence and indifference. In the face of this overwhelming personal grief and public scrutiny, the surviving Wideners responded in the manner typical of their class and era, through monumental philanthropy. These acts were undoubtedly driven by genuine love and loss, but they also served consciously or unconsciously as a form of reputation management, an attempt to reshape the family narrative from one of tragic Gilded Age victims into one of enduring civic benefactors. The first and most direct response came from Eleanor Elkins Widener. Just months after the sinking, while still reeling from the loss of her husband and son, she contacted Harvard University. Harry, her beloved son, had been a passionate Harvard alumnus and had often spoken of his desire to one day donate his magnificent book collection to the university library. Harvard's existing library, Gore Hall, was notoriously overcrowded and inadequate. Eleanor made Harvard an offer. She would fund the construction of a new state-of-the-art library, a building vast enough to house the university's entire collection, on the condition that it serve as a permanent memorial to her son. The cost was staggering, an initial pledge of $2 million, later increased, making it one of the largest single donations Harvard had ever received. Harvard accepted immediately. The Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library was designed by Horace Trumbauer, the same architect who had built Linwood Hall, in collaboration with the prominent Boston firm of Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge. Construction began quickly. Dedicated in June 1915, just months before Peter Widener's death, the Widener Library remains the centerpiece of the Harvard library system, one of the largest and most important academic libraries in the world. At its heart lies the Harry Elkins Widener collection, housed in a special memorial room designed to replicate Harry's own library. It contains the 3,500 rare volumes he had collected, including his treasured Bacon essays. The terms of the gift were famously specific, reflecting both Eleanor's grief and perhaps a touch of Gilded Age eccentricity. They stipulated that the collection could never be moved, that no single brick of the building could ever be altered, and, most famously, that Harvard must teach every undergraduate student how to swim, a poignant, if perhaps apocryphal, tribute to her son who could not. The Widener Library was a masterstroke of memorial philanthropy. It transformed Harry's tragic premature death into a lasting legacy of scholarship. It permanently linked the Widener name not with the disaster of the Titanic, but with the enduring prestige of Harvard University. It was an act of profound maternal love, but also an incredibly effective piece of public relations, cementing the family's place in the annals of American higher education. Eleanor herself moved forward. In 1915, the same year the library was dedicated, she remarried. Her second husband was Dr. Alexander Hamilton Rice, Jr., a wealthy physician, explorer, and geographer from a prominent Newport family. Eleanor embraced her new husband's adventurous life, accompanying him on arduous expeditions into the Amazon basin in South America during the 1910s and 1920s. She became a respected figure in exploration circles, funding much of Rice's research and contributing to geographical societies. She largely withdrew from Philadelphia society, spending her later years at her grand Newport mansion, Miramar, another Horace Trumbauer creation. With Peter Widener's death in 1915, the primary responsibility for managing the family fortune, and crucially, the enormous art collection, fell to his only surviving son, Joseph Early Widener. Joseph, unlike his brother George, was less interested in the gritty details of finance and industry. His passion, inherited from his father, was art and even more intensely thoroughbred horse racing. Joseph continued to build upon his father's art collection, adding significant works, particularly French Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings, reflecting his own more modern tastes. He maintained Linwood Hall as a private museum, occasionally opening its galleries to scholars and dignitaries. He also became a towering figure in the world of horse racing, establishing Erdenheim Farm near Philadelphia as a premier breeding and racing stable. His horses won numerous prestigious races, including the Kentucky Derby in 1933 with his colt Broker's Tip. But Joseph also recognized the changing tides. The Gilded Age was over, replaced by the Progressive Era's income taxes, and later the economic devastation of the Great Depression. Maintaining a private palace like Linwood Hall, with its staggering upkeep costs, became increasingly untenable. The art collection, while a source of immense pride, was also a vast illiquid asset. Furthermore, the cultural landscape had shifted. The era of the private aristocratic art collection was giving way to the rise of public museums. Philanthropists like Andrew Mellon, Samuel Kress, and Chester Dale were making plans to donate their own vast collections to form a new national gallery in Washington, D.C. In 1942, amidst the patriotic fervor of World War II, Joseph Widener made his final defining philanthropic gesture. He donated the heart of the Widener Art Collection, over 2,000 works, including arguably the most important pieces gathered by his father, to the newly formed National Gallery of Art in Washington. The donation was transformative for the fledgling museum. It included masterpieces like Raphael's Small Cowper Madonna, Rembrandt's The Mill, Van Dyck's Marchesa, Elena Grimaldi Cataneo, and numerous other works by the greatest names in European art history. The value at the time was estimated at $19 million. Today its worth would be in the billions. It instantly established the National Gallery as one of the world's premier art institutions. Like Eleanor's gift to Harvard, Joseph's donation was a complex act. It was undoubtedly a gesture of immense public generosity, securing the Widener legacy in the nation's capital. It also provided significant tax advantages for the Widener estate, and, occurring during wartime, it was framed as a patriotic act, a transfer of European cultural treasures to the safety of American shores. It was the final grand act of Gilded Age philanthropy, a way for Joseph to both honor his father's collection and unburden the family from the immense cost of maintaining it privately. The Widener name also became attached to Widener University, located near Philadelphia. However, this connection is less direct than the Harvard Library or the National Gallery donation. The institution, originally founded as a military preparatory school, received significant financial support from the Widener family over many decades, particularly during the 1960s and 1970s. In recognition of this long-standing generosity, the school was renamed Widener College in 1972 and later Widener University. While a significant philanthropic act, it lacks the direct, poignant connection to the Titanic tragedy that defines the Harvard Library. Taken together, these major philanthropic acts, the Widener Library and the National Gallery donation, served to reshape the public memory of the Widener family. They overshadowed the controversial origins of Peter Widener's fortune in wartime profiteering and traction monopolies. They provided a narrative of cultural enrichment and civic virtue that counterbalanced the image of Gilded Age excess and the tragedy of the Titanic. Whether consciously intended as damage control or simply the natural evolution of a Gilded Age fortune-seeking legitimacy, the result was the same. The Widener name became permanently associated with some of America's greatest cultural and educational institutions, a legacy purchased in part by the immense and ultimately fragile fortune built by the butcher's son from Philadelphia. Everybody hated them. While Peter Widener and his family were building palaces, amassing masterpieces, and cementing their place atop American society, the ground beneath them was shifting. The very Gilded Age excesses that fueled their rise also generated a powerful nationwide backlash. The period roughly spanning from the 1890s to the 1920s became known as the Progressive Era, a time of intense social and political reform aimed squarely at the perceived evils of unchecked corporate power, municipal corruption, and stark economic inequality, the very forces Peter Widener had so skillfully mastered. His streetcar monopolies, his alliances with the great trusts, his vast ostentatious wealth, and the often brutal labor practices that underpinned his empire made him a prime target for the era's reformers, muckraking journalists, and increasingly militant labor movements. The Widener's carefully constructed facade of respectability could not fully shield them from the rising tide of public anger and the demand for accountability. The most direct and persistent criticism leveled against Peter Widener concerned the very foundation of his fortune, the Philadelphia Traction Company, and the alleged municipal corruption that enabled its creation. While Widener himself cultivated an image of a shrewd, far-sighted businessman bringing order and modernity to urban transit, critics painted a far darker picture. They saw him as a quintessential robber baron, a man who had subverted democracy for personal profit, using bribery and political manipulation to secure a monopoly that exploited the citizens of Philadelphia. The epicenter of this alleged corruption was Philadelphia's City Hall. During the Gilded Age, Philadelphia gained a notorious reputation chronicled by crusading journalists like Lincoln Steffens in his famous 1903 McClure's Magazine article, Philadelphia, Corrupt and Contented, as one of the most politically rotten cities in America. A powerful, entrenched Republican machine controlled virtually every aspect of municipal government, from the mayor's office and the city council down to the police force and the awarding of public contracts. Steffens and others described a system where votes were openly bought, political offices were treated as personal fiefdoms, and valuable public franchises for gas, water, electricity, and crucially transportation were handed out to politically connected insiders in exchange for kickbacks or campaign contributions. Peter Widener, critics charged, was not just a beneficiary of this system. He was one of its architects. His early foray into politics, serving as city treasurer and on the city council in the 1870s, was seen not as civic service, but as an apprenticeship in the mechanics of graft. He learned firsthand how franchises were awarded, how regulatory oversight could be neutralized, and which palms needed to be greased. When he formed the Philadelphia Traction Company with William Elkins in 1883, he allegedly brought this insider knowledge and his political connections directly into the business strategy. Newspapers like the Philadelphia Inquirer, particularly during periods of reformist fervor, published numerous reports alleging specific instances of bribery and undue influence connected to the traction company. While proving direct cash payments was difficult in an era of lax record-keeping and political obfuscation, the circumstantial evidence was damning. Franchise renewals for Widener's competitors seemed inexplicably delayed. City ordinances favoring Philadelphia Traction sailed through the council with little debate. Attempts by reformers to regulate fares or mandate safety improvements were consistently defeated. The public paid the price. With near total monopoly control by the 1890s, the traction company faced little pressure to improve service or keep fares low. Overcrowding on the trolleys was rampant. Service to poorer outlying neighborhoods was often inadequate. And most infuriatingly, the company repeatedly sought to raise the standard 5-cent fare. These attempts, like the push to raise fares to 6 or 7 cents in the mid-1890s, sparked widespread public outrage and organized resistance. The Philadelphia Transit Strike of 1895 was the most dramatic manifestation of this discontent. It began as a labor dispute, with workers demanding higher wages, shorter hours, and recognition of their nascent union, the Amalgamated Association of Street Railway Employees. But the strike quickly tapped into broader public anger over the traction company's monopoly power and perceived arrogance. When the company controlled by Widener and Elkins refused to negotiate and brought in strikebreakers, the city erupted. Trolley cars, operated by strikebreakers, were attacked, tracks were barricaded, and violent clashes broke out between strikers, their sympathizers, and the police, who were widely seen as protecting the company's interests. The strike paralyzed the city for weeks, highlighting the deep class tensions and the resentment simmering beneath the surface of Philadelphia's Gilded Age prosperity. While the company ultimately broke the strike through force and political maneuvering, the event further cemented the image of Widener and the traction ring as ruthless monopolists, indifferent to the welfare of both their workers and the public. This local struggle in Philadelphia mirrored a national reckoning with the power of the great trusts. The progressive era saw the rise of muckraking journalism, a new form of investigative reporting dedicated to exposing the dark underbelly of American industry and politics. Writers like Ida Tarbell, whose meticulous expose of Standard Oil led to its breakup, became national heroes, While no single muckraker focused exclusively on Peter Widener, with the same intensity Tarbell applied to Rockefeller, his traction empires, along with his stakes in U.S. steel and American tobacco, made him a frequent target of criticism in articles denouncing the evils of monopoly. Magazines like McClure's, Collier's, and Everybody's Magazine published numerous articles exploring the consolidation of industries, the manipulation of stock markets, and the corrupting influence of corporate money in politics. Widener, as a key player in the traction syndicates that controlled transit in major cities across the country, was often cited as a prime example of a robber baron whose pursuit of profit trampled competition and exploited the public interest. These articles, read by millions, shaped a national narrative that cast men like Widener not as captains of industry, but as threats to democracy. The Titanic disaster in 1912 brought a different kind of scrutiny, focusing less on Widener's business practices and more on the perceived arrogance and negligence of the Gilded Age elite he represented. The sinking was a profound shock to a world that had placed its faith in technological progress and the inherent superiority of its ruling class. The staggering loss of life, particularly among steerage passengers, starkly highlighted the brutal class divisions of the era. The fact that there were not enough lifeboats for everyone on board, a direct consequence of outdated regulations, and the shipping line's focus on luxury over safety, became a symbol of corporate indifference to human life. As a major investor and director of the International Mercantile Marine, the trust that owned the White Star Line, Peter Widener was indirectly implicated in the disaster. While he bore no direct operational responsibility for the Titanic, his position placed him within the circle of financiers, led by J.P. Morgan, who controlled the shipping line. The U.S. Senate investigation into the sinking, chaired by Senator William Alden Smith, was a dramatic public inquiry that exposed numerous failures. Testimony revealed that the Titanic had received multiple warnings of ice but had maintained high speed. It confirmed the critical shortage of lifeboats. It highlighted confusion and incompetence during the evacuation. While the investigation focused primarily on the actions of Captain Smith, the ship's officers, and White Star Line Chairman J. Bruce Ismay, it inevitably cast a shadow over the entire IMM leadership, including its directors. The investigation laid bare the potential conflicts between profit and safety in the competitive North Atlantic shipping trade. IMM, critics argued, had prioritized speed, luxury, and maximizing passenger revenue over prudent safety measures. While Widener himself was spared the direct public grilling that Ismay endured, the disaster undeniably tarnished the reputation of the entire enterprise he was associated with. It reinforced the progressive era narrative that the great corporations, driven by an insatiable hunger for profit, had become reckless and unaccountable, willing to gamble with human lives. The deaths of his own son and grandson aboard the ship transformed this critique from an abstract political issue into a devastating personal tragedy for Widener, but it did not shield the family name from the broader public backlash against the system that had allowed the disaster to happen. Beyond the specific scandals of traction monopolies and the Titanic, the Widener family also faced criticism for the perceived social abuses inherent in their Gilded Age lifestyle and business practices. The progressive era was a time of heightened awareness of social injustice, from the plight of immigrant workers to the ostentatious wastefulness of the super-rich. The labor practices associated with Widener's enterprises were a frequent target. The construction and operation of the vast streetcar networks relied heavily on low-wage, often immigrant labor. Track layers, construction workers, and maintenance crews frequently worked long hours in dangerous conditions for minimal pay. As noted in Pennsylvania labor reports from the 1890s, accidents on the trolley lines were common, resulting in dozens of injuries and fatalities each year. While Widener provided jobs, critics argued he did so by exploiting a vulnerable workforce with little power to demand better treatment. His fierce opposition to unionization further reinforced this image. The family's philanthropy, while substantial, also drew criticism for its perceived elitism and potential self-interest. Peter Widener's art collecting, while ultimately benefiting the nation through the National Gallery donation, was seen by some contemporaries as less an act of public service and more a form of cultural imperialism, using American industrial wealth to acquire European treasures, thereby asserting a kind of cultural dominance. His initial philanthropic efforts were also criticized for being narrowly focused on the elite institutions and interests of Philadelphia's upper class, largely excluding the city's growing immigrant and working-class populations. Unlike reformers like Jane Addams, who focused on settlement houses and direct aid to the poor, Widener's Gilded Age philanthropy often seemed designed primarily to burnish his own legacy among his peers. Even the family's monumental home, Linwood Hall, became a symbol of Gilded Age excess and waste. While intended as a showcase of American wealth and taste, its sheer scale and opulence struck many as obscene, particularly in contrast to the poverty experienced by many Philadelphians. The staggering cost of maintaining the estate, estimated at $1 million per year even in the early 20th century, became a subject of critical commentary. As the economic hardships of the Great Depression took hold in the 1930s, the idea of maintaining such a private palace seemed increasingly anachronistic and offensive. Joseph Widener's eventual decision to donate the art collection and the subsequent sale and abandonment of Linwood Hall itself can be seen in part as a belated acknowledgement that the era of such unrestrained private splendor was over. Internal family dynamics also occasionally spilled into public view, revealing tensions beneath the surface of Gilded Age decorum. Following Peter Widener's death in 1915, a dispute over the inheritance reportedly arose between his surviving son, Joseph Widener, and his daughter-in-law, Eleanor Elkins Widener. The details remained largely private, characteristic of the family's aversion to public scandal, but reports suggested disagreements over the division of the estate, particularly the control and disposition of the massive art collection. The matter was eventually settled out of court, but it hinted at the complex financial and personal legacies Peter Widener had left behind. Ultimately, Peter Widener and his family navigated the treacherous currents of the Progressive era with remarkable success, at least in terms of preserving their fortune and avoiding legal catastrophe. Unlike Rockefeller, Widener was never subjected to a federal antitrust breakup. Unlike some other municipal bosses, he was never indicted for corruption. He skillfully used his wealth, political connections, and a veneer of philanthropic respectability to deflect the most serious challenges. However, the criticisms leveled against him during this era, the allegations of bribery, the exploitation of labor, the arrogance of monopoly power, the ostentatious display of wealth, stuck. They became part of the enduring image of the robber baron, a figure both admired for his ambition and reviled for his methods. The Progressive era backlash may not have destroyed the Widener empire during Peter's lifetime, but it fundamentally altered the public perception of great wealth and corporate power. The unquestioned deference of the Gilded Age was replaced by a new era of scrutiny and demands for reform. The Wideners, despite their palaces and masterpieces, could not remain entirely insulated from this shift. The Titanic tragedy, occurring at the height of the progressive movement, became a brutal public symbol of their era's failings, forever linking the family name not just to immense wealth, but to the profound human cost of unchecked ambition. The slow death of a dynasty. The sinking of the Titanic was more than just a devastating personal loss for the Widener family. It was an irreparable blow to the very structure and future of the dynasty Peter A.B. Widener had meticulously constructed. The deaths of George Dunton Widener, the designated heir, and his brilliant son Harry Elkins Widener, the potential cultural torchbearer, created a vacuum at the heart of the family that could never be filled. This rupture, combined with the changing economic tides of the 20th century and the inevitable dispersal of assets across subsequent generations, marked the beginning of the end for the Wideners as a cohesive, dominant force. The Gilded Age empire, built with such ruthless focus by the patriarch, began a slow, inexorable dissolution, leaving behind scattered fortunes, legendary philanthropic monuments, and the haunting shell of its greatest palace. The immediate dynastic crisis was stark. Peter Widener had envisioned a clear line of succession, from himself to George, and then presumably to George's sons, Harry and his younger brother George Dunton Widener Jr. The Titanic obliterated this plan. With George Sr. and Harry gone, the weight of the future fell unexpectedly onto two figures: Peter's only surviving son, Joseph Early Widener, and George's widow, Eleanor Elkins Widener. Joseph, born in 1871, was cut from a different cloth than his pragmatic father or his financier brother. His passions lay not in traction, monopolies, or steel mergers, but in the refined worlds of art collecting and, above all, thoroughbred horse racing. While capable in business, his heart was in the aesthetics of beauty and the thrill of the track. He inherited his father's love for old masters, but expanded the collection with his own eye, particularly towards French 18th century art and later Impressionists. He also transformed the family's Erdenheim farm into one of America's premier racing stables. This shift in focus from industrial creation to aristocratic pursuits was characteristic of second and third generation wealth in the Gilded Age. But in Joseph's case, it meant the family lacked a leader with Peter Widener's singular empire-building drive. Eleanor Elkins Widener, George's widow, emerged from the Titanic tragedy as a figure of immense wealth and social standing, but also profound grief. She controlled not only her substantial inheritance from her husband, but also her own significant fortune from the Elkins family. Her immediate focus became memorializing her lost son, culminating in the monumental gift of the Widener Library to Harvard in 1915. This act secured Harry's legacy, but also signaled Eleanor's turn towards philanthropy, and soon a life removed from the core Widener business operations. The first tremor of internal conflict reportedly occurred shortly after Peter Widener's death in 1915. While the patriarch's will clearly left the bulk of the estate and control of the art collection to Joseph, Eleanor, as the widow of the eldest son and a major heiress in her own right, allegedly raised disputes over the division of assets, particularly concerning pieces within the art collection. Details remained private, consistent with the family's aversion to public scandal, but reports suggested a tense negotiation was required to settle the inheritance between the surviving brother and his sister-in-law. The matter was resolved out of court, but it hinted at the complexities and potential rivalries inherent in managing such a vast, multi-generational fortune, especially after the direct line of succession had been broken. The dynastic problem extended to the next generation. George Sr. and Eleanor had 3 children, Harry, George Jr., and a daughter, Eleanor Widener Dixon. George Jr. served with distinction in World War I, but crucially for the patriarchal structure of Gilded Age dynasties, he had no sons of his own. He married Jessie Sloan in 1917, and they had 2 daughters. While accomplished in their own right, the absence of a male heir in this line meant the Widener name, as carried through the eldest son's branch, would effectively end with George Jr. The family's continuation, therefore, flowed primarily through 2 lines: Joseph Widener's branch and George Sr.'s daughter, Eleanor Widener Dixon. Eleanor Widener Dixon married Fitz Eugene Dixon Sr. in 1912, shortly after the Titanic disaster. Dixon Sr. came from a prominent Philadelphia family with its own wealth derived from street railways. This union kept a significant portion of the Widener fortune connected to Philadelphia's elite social and financial circles. Their son, Fitz Eugene Dixon Jr., became a prominent figure in Philadelphia, known less for industry and more for civic leadership and sports ownership. He owned stakes in the Philadelphia Phillies, the 76ers, the Flyers, and the Wings, embodying the shift from industrial creation to the more passive civic-oriented roles, often adopted by later generations of great wealth. He became a beloved local figure, but he was a sportsman and philanthropist, not an empire builder in the mold of his great-grandfather. Joseph Widener, meanwhile, had 2 children, Peter Errol Brown Widener II and Josephine Fifi Widener. Peter II served in World War I and later became involved in the family's horse racing operations, but he lacked his father's passion and his grandfather's drive. He gained some notoriety for his 1940 memoir, Without Drums, a book that served as a poignant, if somewhat self-pitying elegy for the vanishing world of Gilded Age splendor. The book lamented the decline of the great American palaces like Linwood Hall, burdened by taxes and changing social norms, portraying his generation as the inheritors of a magnificent but unsustainable past. "We are the dispossessed," he wrote, "living in the shadows of giants." Fifi Widener led the life of a prominent socialite, known for her involvement in the equestrian world and her multiple marriages, including one to the sportsman Axel Wichfeld. Her life, like her brother's, reflected the dispersal of the family's focus away from the core industrial and financial activities that had generated the initial fortune. Joseph Widener himself remained the patriarch of the family and the custodian of its greatest treasures until his death in 1943. He oversaw the family's business interests, managed the art collection, and reigned as a king in the world of thoroughbred racing. His famed horse Brevity nearly won the Kentucky Derby, and his stable, which included 1934 Belmont Stakes winner Peace Chance, produced numerous champions. He maintained Linwood Hall in grand style through the 1920s, hosting royalty and dignitaries. But Joseph also presided over the beginning of the fortune's decline, accelerated by the Great Depression of 1929. While the Widener wealth was diversified, the stock market crash and the ensuing economic collapse took a heavy toll. Estimates suggest the family may have lost as much as 50% of its liquid assets. Key holdings, like their substantial shares in U.S. Steel, had to be sold off to cover losses and maintain liquidity. The vast income streams from traction monopolies also dwindled as the automobile began its inexorable rise, rendering the electric streetcar increasingly obsolete in the 1920s and 1930s. The Depression fundamentally altered the economics of maintaining a Gilded Age lifestyle. The introduction of federal income tax and estate taxes during the Progressive Era, taxes Peter A.B. Widener had likely fought tooth and nail against, made inheriting and preserving great fortunes far more challenging. The astronomical cost of running Linwood Hall, with its army of servants, its private power plant, its acres of manicured gardens, and its priceless art collection requiring constant security and conservation, became an unsustainable burden even for the Wideners. Joseph Widener began quietly selling off portions of the estate's land in the 1930s. After his death in 1943, his children faced a stark reality. The era of the American private palace was definitively over. Peter II and Fifi had neither the inclination nor perhaps the relative financial means to maintain Linwood Hall in the style to which it was accustomed. In 1948, Linwood Hall and its remaining contents were sold at auction. The palace that Peter Widener had built for $8 million just 50 years earlier fetched a mere $130,000. It was purchased by a fundamentalist Baptist seminary, led by Carl McIntyre, who saw the Gilded Age mansion as a symbol of worldly vanity to be repurposed for religious education. The seminary occupied the building for several decades but lacked the resources for its proper upkeep. They sold off many of the remaining interior fixtures and architectural elements. Eventually, the seminary also moved out, and Linwood Hall was abandoned. Today, Linwood Hall stands empty and decaying in Elkins Park, a haunting, colossal ruin. Its boarded-up windows and crumbling facade are a stark visual metaphor for the fate of the Widener Dynasty itself. Once the largest and most opulent private home in Pennsylvania, a symbol of absolute Gilded Age power, it is now a forgotten relic, too vast and too expensive to restore, too historically significant to demolish. Its slow decay mirrors the dispersal and fading of the family name that built it. Eleanor Elkins Widener Rice, the Titanic survivor, lived a long and vastly different life after the tragedy. Her marriage to Alexander Hamilton Rice Jr. opened a new chapter focused on exploration and scientific philanthropy. She accompanied her husband on dangerous expeditions deep into the Amazon rainforest, navigating uncharted rivers and documenting indigenous cultures. She became a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society in London, a rare honor for a woman at the time. She generously funded Rice's geographical research and the establishment of the Institute of Geographical Exploration at Harvard. Her Newport mansion, Miramar, became a center for this work, filled with maps, artifacts, and scholarly pursuits. She died in Paris in 1937, having transformed herself from a Philadelphia society queen into a respected patron of science and exploration, a life path unimaginable had George Widener survived the Titanic. The Widener legacy today is thus fragmented and largely institutional. The Widener Library at Harvard stands as a magnificent tribute to Harry Elkins Widener, though few students passing through its imposing gates likely know the tragic story behind its name. The Widener collection at the National Gallery of Art remains one of the museum's foundational pillars, showcasing the unparalleled taste of Peter A.B. Widener, yet the name itself may not resonate with the average museum goer. Widener University carries the family name, acknowledging their long-standing financial support, but the direct connection to the founding dynasty is primarily historical. The descendants, scattered through the Dixon line, and Joseph Widener's grandchildren and great-grandchildren are prominent in their respective communities but no longer command the national stage as a unified dynastic force. The vast industrial and financial empire built by Peter A.B. Widener, the traction companies, the steel holdings, the tobacco shares, was largely liquidated or dispersed long ago, rendered obsolete by technological change and diminished by taxes and time. The story of the Wideners after the Titanic is not one of continued ascent, but of a slow, graceful, and sometimes painful decline from the impossible heights of the Gilded Age. The dynasty was mortally wounded by the loss of its heirs, further eroded by economic depression and changing tax laws, and ultimately unable to sustain the colossal weight of its own initial success. Unlike the Rockefellers, who successfully transitioned their fortune into enduring philanthropic institutions and maintained a cohesive family presence for generations, the Wideners serve as a stark reminder of the Gilded Age's inherent fragility. Their immense wealth, built on the back of America's explosive urban growth, proved vulnerable to the unpredictable blows of personal tragedy and the inevitable tides of historical change. The butcher's son built an empire. The iceberg ensured it would not last. Did they sink the Titanic? The sheer scale of the Widener fortune, combined with the dramatic, almost unbelievable tragedy of the Titanic, inevitably created fertile ground for myth and suspicion. In the decades following the disaster, and particularly with the rise of the Internet, the Widener name became entangled in a web of conspiracy theories, narratives that sought to find hidden motives and sinister plots beneath the surface of historical events. These theories, often lurid and lacking credible evidence, focused primarily on the family's connection to the ill-fated ocean liner, attempting to recast the Wideners not as victims but as potential perpetrators or beneficiaries of a calculated catastrophe. While largely dismissed by serious historians, these persistent myths underscore the enduring public fascination with Gilded Age power and the lingering unease surrounding the circumstances of the Titanic disaster. The reality of the Wideners' influence, however, lay not in secret plots, but in the tangible, though ultimately fading, soft power they wielded through their monumental philanthropy and their position within America's social elite. The most enduring and widespread Titanic conspiracy theories involving the Wideners often intertwine with broader narratives about financial manipulation and powerful elites orchestrating events for their own gain. One persistent, though easily debunked strand alleges that the sinking was intentionally caused to collect insurance money. This theory points to the fact that the International Mercantile Marine, the J.P. Morgan, controlled trust that owned the White Star Line, and thus the Titanic, was reportedly in financial distress in 1912. Proponents of this theory suggest that Morgan, possibly with the complicity of investors like Peter Widener, arranged for the ship to sink on its maiden voyage to cash in on a massive insurance policy, supposedly held through Lloyd's of London. This insurance fraud theory collapses under basic scrutiny. While IMM did face financial challenges, deliberately sinking the most advanced, expensive, and highly publicized ship in the world, an act that would guarantee catastrophic loss of life, trigger global outrage, and inevitably lead to intense investigations, would be an act of corporate suicide, not a viable financial strategy. Furthermore, investigations after the sinking revealed that the Titanic was actually underinsured, meaning the payout would not have come close to covering the financial loss, let alone the reputational damage. Historians like Walter Lord and Don Lynch have exhaustively documented the chain of events, the speed, the ice warnings, the flawed design, the insufficient lifeboats that led to the disaster, finding overwhelming evidence of negligence and hubris, but none of deliberate sabotage for insurance purposes. The presence of Peter Widener's own son and grandson among the victims further strains the credibility of any theory suggesting he was complicit in intentionally sinking the ship. A more elaborate and politically charged conspiracy theory attempts to link the Titanic disaster to the creation of the U.S. Federal Reserve in 1913. This narrative, popular in certain anti-government and fringe financial circles, alleges that the sinking was orchestrated by a cabal of international bankers, including J.P. Morgan, to eliminate prominent opponents of the planned central bank who happened to be booked on the voyage. According to this theory, figures like John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus, all immensely wealthy men who perished on the Titanic, were staunch opponents of the Federal Reserve Act. Morgan, the theory goes, lured them onto the unsinkable ship and then arranged for its demise, conveniently removing these powerful obstacles to his financial agenda. Peter Widener, as a close Morgan ally and IMM director, is sometimes implicated as being part of this supposed plot, or at least aware of it. The deaths of his own son and grandson are often explained away as either unintended collateral damage or a necessary sacrifice to maintain the conspiracy's secrecy. This theory, too, crumbles under historical examination. There is no credible evidence that Astor, Guggenheim, or Strauss were particularly active or influential opponents of the Federal Reserve concept in the years leading up to 1913. While they were powerful businessmen, their primary focus was on their own industries, not complex central banking legislation. Furthermore, the idea that J.P. Morgan, a man who operated at the highest levels of global finance, would resort to mass murder on the high seas to eliminate political opposition defies logic and lacks any supporting documentation. The creation of the Federal Reserve was a complex, multi-year political process involving intense debate and compromise among bankers, politicians, and academics. It was not decided by the convenient removal of 3 millionaires on a doomed ocean liner. The Widener family's tragic loss on the Titanic aligns perfectly with the known facts of the disaster. Recasting it as part of a sinister banking conspiracy requires ignoring overwhelming evidence in favor of unsubstantiated speculation, often found on fringe websites and internet forums. Beyond the Titanic, other, less dramatic conspiracy theories touched upon the Widener's influence in other spheres. During the Gilded Age itself, Peter Widener's rapid accumulation of one of America's largest art collections generated suspicion among some contemporaries. Critics, particularly those wary of the nouveau riche industrialists invading the established cultural domains of old money, sometimes suggested that figures like Widener were not genuine connoisseurs, but were merely using European art acquisitions as a tool for social climbing or even cultural dominance. The theory articulated by some art historians and social critics of the 1920s was that these industrialists were plundering Europe's heritage to assert America's newfound global power and to launder their often controversial business reputations by associating themselves with the prestige of old masters. The role of dealers like Joseph Duveen, who famously catered to the Gilded Age plutocrats and sometimes inflated provenances or encouraged competitive bidding wars, fueled the perception that art collecting at this level was less about aesthetics and more about asserting financial and social supremacy. While perhaps less a conspiracy theory and more a historical critique of Gilded Age cultural practices, this narrative questioned the motives behind Widener's seemingly benevolent patronage of the arts. Dismissing these conspiracy theories, however, does not mean dismissing the Wideners' very real influence. While they may not have plotted to sink ships or control global banking, the family wielded significant soft power through channels that were entirely conventional yet profoundly impactful. Their philanthropy, their social standing, and their deep entanglement with the core institutions of American wealth and culture. The most enduring and visible legacy of the Widener family lies in their transformative philanthropic gifts to major American institutions. These acts, particularly the funding of the Widener Library at Harvard and the donation of the core art collection to the National Gallery of Art represent a scale of giving that permanently shaped the cultural and educational landscape of the nation. The Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library at Harvard University stands as perhaps the most poignant example. Eleanor Elkins Widener's gift, made in the immediate aftermath of the Titanic tragedy, was not merely a generous donation. It was an act that fundamentally reshaped Harvard Yard and the university's intellectual infrastructure. The $2 million she provided funded the construction of a colossal building designed by Horace Trumbauer, capable of housing millions of volumes. It replaced the inadequate Gore Hall and became, overnight, one of the world's great university libraries. The library's very existence is a testament to the scale of the Widener fortune and Eleanor's determination to create an enduring monument to her lost son. The specific conditions of the gift, the memorial room housing Harry's personal collection of 3,500 rare books, the stipulation against altering the building, the apocryphal swimming requirement, added layers of personal meaning and public fascination. This single act permanently linked the Widener name to the pinnacle of American higher education, associating it not with traction monopolies or sunken ships, but with learning, scholarship, and institutional prestige. Equally significant was Joseph Widener's donation of the family's art collection to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. in 1942. This gift, comprising over 2,000 works including undisputed masterpieces by Raphael, Rembrandt, Vermeer, Van Dyck, and many others, was one of the founding collections that instantly established the NGA as a world-class museum. The value of the donated works, estimated at $19 million then, translates to billions today. This act of immense generosity secured the Widener legacy within the nation's capital, placing their collection alongside those of Mellon, Kress, and Dale as pillars of America's public art heritage. It represented the culmination of Peter Widener's Gilded Age ambition to achieve cultural legitimacy, transforming his private passion into a permanent public treasure. While potentially motivated in part by tax considerations and the unsustainable cost of maintaining the collection privately, the donation's impact on the National Gallery and on public access to great art in America is undeniable. The family's long-standing support for the institution now known as Widener University represents a third, though perhaps more localized, strand of their philanthropic influence. While not involving a single dramatic gift on the scale of the Harvard Library or the NGA donation, the family's consistent financial contributions over many decades played a crucial role in the growth and development of this Delaware County institution. The renaming of the school in their honor in 1972 solidified this connection, linking the Widener name to education and community development within the greater Philadelphia region, where the family's fortune originated. Beyond these major institutional gifts, the Wideners wielded influence through their deep integration into the social elite of the Gilded Age and early 20th century. Peter Widener's move from Philadelphia butcher to associate of J.P. Morgan and Andrew Carnegie was a remarkable ascent. His sons and grandchildren moved easily within the highest circles of American society, attending elite schools, joining exclusive clubs, marrying into other prominent families, and participating in the expensive hobbies that defined their class. Joseph Widener's passion for thoroughbred horse racing is a prime example of this social influence. His Erdenheim farm was not just a hobby, it was a major force in the sport of kings. He imported top European bloodlines, bred champion horses, and achieved racing's ultimate prize with his victory in the 1933 Kentucky Derby. His influence extended to the governance of the sport. He served as president of the prestigious Hialeah Park racetrack in Florida and was a key figure in national racing associations. This involvement placed him at the center of a powerful network of wealthy sportsmen, breeders, and financiers. A world where business deals were often made and social alliances cemented amidst the glamour of the racetrack. While less tangible than building a library or donating a Rembrandt, this influence within elite social and sporting circles was a significant component of the Widener Dynasty's power and prestige during Joseph's lifetime. However, it is crucial to place the Widener's influence in proper perspective, particularly when compared to other great American and global dynasties. While their wealth was immense and their impact on specific institutions profound, their overall reach and enduring institutional footprint were ultimately less extensive than families like the Rockefellers or European counterparts like the Rothschilds. The Rockefellers, for instance, translated their initial industrial fortune into a vast, multi-generational network of philanthropic institutions. The Rockefeller Foundation, the University of Chicago, Rockefeller University, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, that continue to shape global policy in health, education, and international relations to this day. They maintained a cohesive family presence and actively managed these institutions for generations. The Rothschilds, operating on a global scale for centuries, built an unparalleled international banking dynasty with deep political connections across multiple continents. The Wideners, by contrast, did not create such enduring, self-perpetuating institutions bearing their name, aside from the specific library and university connections. Their core industrial empire, the traction companies, became obsolete. Their vast art collection was dispersed or donated. Their family line, fractured by the Titanic tragedy and lacking a strong patriarchal figure after Peter Widener, gradually faded from the national stage. Their power, while enormous during the Gilded Age, proved less institutionalized and ultimately less durable. It was deeply tied to the specific economic conditions of late 19th and early 20th century urban industrialization, a period that eventually gave way to new technologies, new economic structures, and new forms of wealth. The final verdict on the Widener dynasty, therefore, is not one of hidden conspiracy or enduring global influence. It is rather the quintessential cautionary tale of the American Gilded Age. Their story encapsulates both the astonishing opportunities for wealth creation during that era and its inherent precariousness. Peter Widener's rise exemplifies the potent combination of ambition, timing, and ruthlessness that could propel an individual from humble origins to unimaginable riches by harnessing the forces of urbanization and industrial consolidation. But the subsequent history of the family highlights the fragility of such fortunes. Their reliance on specific, eventually obsolete technologies, their vulnerability to unpredictable personal tragedy, the corrosive effects of inherited wealth without responsibility, and the changing social and economic landscape all contributed to the dynasty's relatively rapid decline from its peak. The conspiracy theories, while largely unfounded, speak to the enduring mystique and public suspicion surrounding the immense, almost unaccountable power wielded by figures like Peter Widener during the Gilded Age. The reality, however, is perhaps more poignant. An empire built with ferocious intensity, reaching unparalleled heights of wealth and splendor, ultimately proved as vulnerable as the great ship that carried its heirs to their doom. The enduring legacy of the Wideners lies not in secrets or hidden control, but in the magnificent public institutions their fortune endowed, and in the haunting, decaying grandeur of Linwood Hall, a silent monument to a Gilded Age dream that, for this family, could not last.